Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the forthcoming novel Brotherless Night.
Do you have any frenemies?
I'm not answering that.
You're good. What? You think you could just do a Trump and take the fifth 440 times? Because we're going to have some questions about this during this podcast.
All I'm prepared to say is that I'm Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the forthcoming novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm taking advantage of my constitutional right against self-incrimination. Is that the other part of this?
I have no comment at this time.
All right. Well, Trump probably would take the fifth in the same situation because he has a large number of frenemies. You could say that Bill Barr counts as a frenemy. His former attorney, Michael Cohen, would count as a frenemy. Maybe members of his own family would count as frenemies.
I always think of Senator Joe Manchin when I think of frenemies because people are always comparing him to Lucy from Charlie Brown. He holds the football in place for the Democratic Party to kick it and then yanks it away and then puts it back in place, and the Democratic Party tees up again. And I feel like our political world is full of characters like this, but so is our literature, I think, more and more in recent years.
Today, we're going to talk about frenemies, real and imagined, with our special guest, Yiyun Li, who is returning to the show to discuss her new novel, The Book of Goose. Yiyun is the author of 6 previous works of fiction: Must I Go, Where Reasons End, Kinder Than Solitude, 1,000 Years of Good Prayers, The Vagrants, and Gold Boy, Emerald Girl, and the memoir, Dear Friend from My Life, I Write to You in Your Life. That's her dog, who's also going to be on the show. She is the recipient of many awards, including the Penn Malamud Award, the Penn Hemingway Award, the Penn Gene Stein Book Award, a MacArthur Fellowship, and a Wyndham Campbell Prize. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, A Public Space, the Best American Short Stories, and the Penn O. Henry Prize Stories. Among other publications, she teaches at Princeton University, my alma mater, where she is now the director of the program in creative writing. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and I apologize for that dog.
It's great to have you with us again. Your novel centers on 2 girls who grow up in the French countryside together, Agnès and Fabienne. They play a series of imaginative games concocted by Fabienne that lead to Agnès becoming famous as the author of a book that, truthfully, the 2 of them have written together. You last came on the show with Bridget Hughes almost exactly a year ago to talk about Tolstoy together. You've often spoken about the inspiration you found in reading other people. And this book, I saw in Publishers Weekly, began with you reading Elizabeth Bowen, whose reviews of novels by French teenagers led you to the information that one of them was a fraud. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that led to the invention not only of Agnès, but of Fabienne?
Yes, so it was an old review of Bowen, just summarizing 4 French child prodigies were, most of them we no longer, read, or even we have never heard of some of the names. And one of them, I found the introduction from Bowen interesting. It's about this French girl from the countryside writing about, post-World War II, the rural France. I found that interesting, and I tried to do a little bit of research. Nobody had ever heard of her, and even in France, nobody had ever heard of her. And the funny thing is, eventually, I found somewhere in a library archive, there's a English school mistress had one sort of entry about this girl saying she was a fraud. So it's one of those cases where you could not find enough things in history or in research, and I think we novelists always love that when there are not enough information, there are not enough stories. So it opens up the space for us to make up stories. So that was where the novel started, was that little bit of fraudulent. It was a literary hoax, I suppose, in history, but it was more than a hoax I was interested in. I wanted to write, just someone forgotten by history.
So I find this to be so juicy, especially as I read the novel and got to a headmistress who is a totally fascinating character. But so it's also about, right, like, because this is this fraud, you have Agnès in the scrap of what you found, but what you don't have at all is Fabienne, who is totally. So can you talk about developing the relationship between the two of them?
Yes. So, I think from the very beginning I knew I didn't want one girl to be in the novel, because that was just reproducing the original hoax, right? One girl somehow, made a fame and then got forgotten. I wanted two girls. Mostly I wanted to write a novel about friendship and about close friendship, the intense friendship between two girls aged 12 to 14, that time, that moment before they turned into sort of, young adult. They were still kids, but no longer little kids. So I just thought I wanted to write a novel about two girls, two friends. And they came together as a pair. And I think they came together because they kept making nonsense when I first started the novel. The very first day I wrote just like a dialogue between the two girls. They were discussing how to grow happiness. Do you grow happiness as a potato, or do you grow happiness as beets? And if one crop failed, they still had another crop. So this was the whole conversation between the two girls saying, how do we grow happiness? I was fascinated. I thought, who are these girls talking about these things? And eventually, Agnès said, what if both crops failed? And then Fabienne, the other character, said, then we're becoming butchers. We'll become butchers. We can just kill animals to feed ourselves. So it's their conversation, it's their sort of interaction that fascinated me. And I just started writing about all these nonsense they made up as games. And eventually, that nonsense game became their book writing game.
So we invited you on the show to talk about frenemies because we were reading the news and thinking about figures in the news like Senator Joe Manchin, who Whitney and I think both detest, and former Attorney General Bill Barr.
Although we did think of this before Manchin finally got his act together and passed that legislation, that the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm going to give him some credit for.
But I think he's we were comparing him earlier to, he often gets compared in the news to Lucy from Charlie Brown, who holds the football for Charlie Brown and then yanks it away. And I just think that he's going to yank it away again. But Agnès and Fabienne in the Book of Goose have such an intense and complicated relationship. And I was thinking about whether a frenemy is someone who turns from a friend to an enemy, arguably, like Bill Barr, who's been in the news criticizing Trump, but also saying he hopes that Trump isn't indicted, or someone more like Manchin, who, right, you're friends with Manchin, he's in your party, and then he says that he's not actually aligned with you. And then he comes back to the fold and you're sort of in conversation again. So I'm curious about how you would define a frenemy and whether you would put Agnès and Fabienne into that category. Because as I read, I was certainly watching their dynamic and sort of thinking, I've had friends like both of these people and have maybe been, hopefully I haven't been both of these people, but I'm curious about your definition.
Right. Actually, it's such an interesting question because, when you said frenemy, and I started to think, first of all, I've never used that word in my life. so
doesn't surprise me.
What a great new word to learn, or at least just to think about it. And I've been thinking, it's funny because I feel that I have friends. I don't know if I have enemy, but I can't tell if I have frenemy either. But I've been thinking about this concept. And I was thinking about concept. I was looking at the trees too. Anytime I have a question, I look at the trees, and I was thinking, when two trees grow next to each other, I probably can call them friends to each other, but they're not frenemy. They're not enemy to each other. So I think frenemy probably are two creatures or two people much closer than those two trees. They grow into each other's space, they compete for something, but they also have to live with each other. They cannot live without each other. So I thought maybe frenemy is a kind of symbiotic relationship, but not mutually beneficial, also mutually detrimental. So that's probably how I would define this. I don't think I think of Fabienne and Agnès as frenemy, but I think they were so close. They're as friends. Their relationship is so close. They probably start to harm each other, But I think that's decided by the distance between the two girls, and I think frenemy. I have a feeling that to me has a little bit of more intention. If you want to hurt each other, there's probably some motivation there, some intention there that I don't see in the girls' relationship.
Interesting.
I think that politics is a good place to look for frenemies, obviously, as we mentioned, but I do think also that the not literature, but writing world is a good place to find where you find a lot of frenemies, right? Where you have people who are friends because it's mutually beneficial, but they're jealous of each other. And then if one person moves ahead in their career, the other one gets angry and begins to undermine them. I'm sure that all of you have had this happen. I've definitely had this happen. We don't talk about it very much, right? Because it's a dangerous topic, and we're not going to mention any names, but I certainly had examples of friends who I thought were my close friends. And then at a certain point, our careers diverged, and I found out, oh, that person's really not my friend. They did this thing that was very mean. And so and it's interesting that, Agnès and Fabienne are engaged in a literary enterprise that I also think lends itself to that kind of who's going to get credit, who should get credit, where's the credit due, who did the work, who didn't do the work, all that sort of stuff.
That's exactly, it's so interesting you mentioned that, because if you put any other, pair of writers collaborating together, I think this question of, who gets the credit, who is not getting the credit, and who's jealous of whom certainly will arise right away. Wait, okay, can I just back up a little and just say, just going back to politics about frenemy, I was thinking about this famous case when I grew up. We had these posters of political figures on our wall. Chairman Mao is in the middle, and Premier Zhou Enlai is next to him, and then General Zhu is next to him. It turned out in that picture, original historical picture, there was another man who used to be Mao's closest ally, and that's the frenemy, and then he became the enemy. So what the propaganda department did was to airbrush him out of the history book and airbrushed him out of the poster. So now you get 3 figures on that poster instead of 4. I think Milan Kundera also wrote that in East Europe, I think in Czechoslovakia, Czech history, they also had one famous, political figure airbrushed out of the poster. So which was interesting. I do think frenemy is possibly more prominent in politics. Also in politics, they can really airbrush each other, out of history book. They can delete each other's existence. I think in writing, it's possibly just people go 2 ways, instead of, I don't know, I think sort of eliminating another person's presence. That to me is a quintessential way of looking at frenemy, because you cannot have this person in your life in the most fundamental way. You cannot have this person's existence there anymore.
So I wonder if you would read a little bit to us from the novel so our listeners can hear Agnès and Fabienne together.
Right. So I think, Sugi, you picked the part where the 2 girls now already wrote a book, and the publisher in Paris was interested in publishing the book. And so they were talking about what they were going to do when the book came out. Did they say September? Perfect. We can finish in the summer. When you go to Paris, you can drop a few hints about the new book, Fabienne said later that evening, when I told her of the Parisians' visit. She did not seem to think much of the visit and the arrangements for me to meet the press. She was making a willow whistle, cutting precisely the right length of a twig, and then twisting it gently. She was good at that. My hands were clumsy, and I either broke the twigs or lost patience before the tender pith could be neatly separated from the green bark. Why don't you want to have your name on the book? I asked. We can tell Monsieur Cheston we wrote the stories together. It's not too late. A book should just bear one name, Fabienne said. Why not two? Fabienne did not reply. Was this finally a question she could not answer? Why can't it be just your name? I asked. You wrote the stories down, she said. You made them up. I'm not interested in being an author. Why not? I'm fine being who I am. That couldn't possibly be true, I thought. And yet, who else could Fabienne be? The girls at school were uninteresting. Swap one girl's clothes with another's. Switch one girl's parents with another's. What difference would it really make? All the girls, other than me, wanted the same things. To own a pair of stockings so their legs would not look bare and childish in their humiliating ankle socks. To have the best notebooks to record those song lyrics, sickening sweet words of dreams and loves and hearts. To be praised by the teachers, but more importantly, to be admired and envied by one another. To catch the attention of the right boys. I would have been one of them had Fabienne not been in my life. What a tragedy that would have been, living an interchangeable life, looking for interchangeable excitements. Why, you look like a sad potato, Fabienne said. What's wrong? I'm only thinking it's a pity that you don't want your name on the book. It would be a pity if I did want that, Fabienne said. Don't you see? No. Oh, you imbecile. Say I wanted to be an author. I would have my name on the book. I could tell people I have several more books in my head. Where would have that leave you? Where would that leave you? What do you mean? I'm making this a two-person game. You're saying that one person, me, Fabienne, could play the game alone. What would you do then? I can still write your stories down for you, I said. You really don't understand, do you? Fabienne said. How hard is it to write things down when you already have them in your head? I could do it myself. Then what? I hesitated. I would watch you being an author, and I would be happy. No, you would be sad, Fabienne said. I would? Yes, Fabienne said. Because you would have no part in the game. The books would have nothing to do with you. And what happened to me would have nothing to do with you. Don't you see? I saw it then. I truly was an idiot for not seeing all the losses I would have to endure, for not knowing that Fabienne minded how I could feel. So you see, I'll write the books and your name will be on them. We're equally essential. What we really need to do is to make you look believable, Fabienne said. I don't see why people won't find you so. Believable in what way? I asked. I remembered Monsieur Chaston puffing on his cigarette and waiting for me to tackle a blank page. Would there be more tests like that? I had never told Fabienne about that page I had written for Monsieur Chaston. Fabienne sighed. When will you stop needing me to explain everything to you? When I get to Paris, I replied.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I mean, that's a passage where Fabienne is actually genuinely being a friend, I think, and expressing her love and care for Agnès. I mean, there are other places where she is, I think, rougher on her. And in fact, toward the end of the book, they have a very similar conversation that turns out differently. But some people have compared them, Agnès and Fabienne, to Elena and Lila from Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend. Not a bad comparison, at least in terms of the talent of the author. I consider those two frenemies. Do you think of them as frenemies? I guess we've already answered that question, but what are other literary models for this kind of relationship or character?
Right. It was interesting because before people made that comparison, it did not occur to me. And when people started to make that comparison, all of a sudden I thought, oh yeah, of course, you can make that comparison. I think oftentimes it's novels about young women, young girls. You would find those kind of relationships. One book came to my mind is The Sweet Days of Discipline by Fleur Yegi. I think that's how you say her name, the Swiss writer. That book was also about two girls in a Swiss boarding school with this close, intense relationship, but also very cold. That book was cold. The whole book gives me a very cold feeling. But then, we have the Mirror Sparks, the prime of Miss Jean Brodie. That, there are 6 girls in that novel, but I think the 6 girls they're all frenemies to each other, right? They love each other. They are close, but they betray each other. They abandon each other. So I think the Miss Jean Brodie, those girls are quintessential frenemies, in my head.
Thinking about the same kind of question of gender that you brought up, and then I kind of went hunting for ones that were not like that, and I thought about The Talented Mr. Ripley. And then
that's what I was just gonna say. That's a great example.
That's very
and then I found that our friends at Crime Reads, which is a part of LitHub, had actually put out an article about frenemies. And then I wondered about in literature, the association between frenemyship and crime. Because one of their other examples was Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter. I was like, what a horrendous example.
Oh my God. Okay.
Or there's, a separate piece. So there's some interesting examples. And I think you're right that a lot of it, there's often, if there's not a young person on both ends, there's a young person on at least one end of that relationship, someone who's struggling for a kind of personal power. And I think in that previous conversation, I think also I was thinking of, Elena and Lila as frenemies, and I think I'm interested in your contention that Agnès and Fabienne are not, and I think that you've hit on that note that makes a distinction between those two pairs, which is that Lila seems more intentionally cruel than Fabienne to me.
Yes, it's funny because Fabienne is cruel, but she is who she is. She's, I think part of her cruelty is also just where she is or who she is, growing up in that environment, but also she does have deep feeling for Agnès, and she, towards the end of the books, especially, I think this threesome, when she made up a boy, right? She made a boy to carry on a love story with her best friend. So again, it's all fiction making, it's all fabrication. But I think frenemy, I think earlier maybe one of you mentioned this concept of betrayal and abandonment. And I think that happens often, betrayal in a frenemy relationship. I don't think that betrayal is here. It's, who neither of them betrays, I don't think Agnès and Fabienne betrayed each other, but I think what happens is they're pushed to the point that they can no longer continue their relationship in the same way because of fame, because of the public intervention, because of the English Finnish in school, their life just, they used to be the same pairs, almost like twins, right? They describe themselves as the same orange, one side facing the sun, much warmer, the other side facing in the shade, it's cool, colder. But they're, the oranges, they're not the same orange anymore. It's cut open to become two half of the same orange, but they're no longer in the same orange shape. So I do think that betrayal comes from the world rather from within them, and that's probably the distinction I would make for them not being called frenemy.
Okay.
And it has to
that's
do
really
with
helpful.
power disparity, I think. Like in the beginning, there's a line that I remember Fabienne or Agnès says she hears Fabienne laugh in a certain way that she knows that she's about to do something that's like dangerous, or like, this is what the kind of laugh she does right before she pushes me into a river, or something. I think it's something along those lines. So Fabienne has the power, that power of being able to violate social rules. And later, Agnès has the power of wealth, or at least security, that Fabienne doesn't have. Does that seem accurate to say?
I think that power, the power dynamic and who's in control of what and who's manipulating whom to do things, that to me is always in a close relationship, whether it's friendship or frenemy, or, there's just something about two people, they're so close to each other, they're sort of their contour, like their contours sort of press into each other. They become porous, in a way. I think their lives bleed into each other's life. Why are you laughing with me? You're just
I just was thinking about Pence and Trump.
Oh no, it is just, there's no way to liberate them from each other in a way. I think they're pressed together, all that pressure. So yeah, so I think in that case, power, control, and manipulation, I think those are the key elements of such a close relationship.
So I wasn't gonna ask you about the boy who Fabienne invents on the theory that potentially was a spoiler, but you have raised him. And so I'm curious about this, because one of the things is like, right, if you have these two people who are so closely pressed into each other, one of the things about it is that there's no room for a third. And at various points in this narrative, there is a third that attempts to intrude, and for one reason or another. And in two of the cases, and I'm thinking of there's a postmaster who is involved in the early scheme to write the book, and he sort of attempts to insert himself into that relationship, and that doesn't work. And then later when Agnès goes to as the real inspiration for your character did, to this finishing school, there is a headmistress who kind of attempts the same thing, and then Agnès herself kind of tries to invite a staff member at the school to almost assume like a greater importance in her life, and that doesn't work either. And like at every turn, any attempt to make this a triangle fails, which is so interesting as like a kind of narrative escalation. It's really fascinating.
Right. It's that's exactly right. That triangulation, for instance, when we talk, I don't know, I think Sugi, when you and I were in the workshop together, like the triangulation of characters, triangles were often talked about in the workshop. But sometimes, as you said, when two people are so close, there's not a third point available or allowed. And I think the narrative, the continuous introduction of the third point or a triangle, actually was exactly for that reason, is they are so close, they cannot allow a third person, real person in the relationship. On the other hand, I thought that was also where Fabienne was so imaginative. She knew there was not going to be a real person in their relationship. So she made up a boy, and that boy seemed to have done some harm to both of them in the end.
So we were talking before about the headmistress character. And I love the headmistress character in this book. I mean, because again, such a complex figure, and she positions herself as a benefactress, but is often actually just brutally cruel. Kind of, I don't know, in the fine tradition of headmistresses at English schools and literature. And her name is Antonia Townsend. And I found myself trying to figure out the sincerity of her intentions. And then I realized, like, as you were referring to before, that's another characteristic or question I associate with frenemies, that there's a friend who can't discern the goodness of the other person's intentions. You know, even if their notion of good doesn't align with hers, do they think they're doing good? So I wonder if you think Mrs. Townsend falls into our frenemy category, or whether she's just a flat out villainess.
No, she's not a flat out villain, although she is very frightening to me too. There are moments she's just too evil, but I do think she actually has some good intention, but she also has some sort of calculation where and what she can gain from the scheme, right? You know, anytime a hoax happens, it's because some people want to make some gain. And I think Mrs. Townsend thinks, you know, she can gain something, but while she's gaining something from the scheme, I think Agnès also gains from the scheme. So that probably is a little bit like, you know, like symbiotic relationship. They can both get something out of this hoax. Yes, I then, of course, in a way, I think she's probably more a frenemy in this novel than anybody else.
So we've discussed other literary examples of frenemies. I want to put in one for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is an interesting example of a frenemy in the same body. But what about, let's talk about other political examples of frenemies, or maybe even celebrity examples of frenemies. We've mentioned Barr and Manchin and Trump and Pence. I did hear recently a story about Richard Nixon when he was Eisenhower's vice president, and Eisenhower just had a heart attack, and they were walking up a flight of stairs, and Nixon looked over at Eisenhower and said, "Race you to the top." And that was a kind of frenemy statement to make.
That is so dark.
My goodness.
Can you think of any other of your favorite frenemies from our public sphere?
I mean, okay, so I have to admit, I'm not familiar in that, but I feel like all the public figures or political figures, they probably are all frenemies to each other. That's my imagination. But I mean, historically, if I read history, you know, if you look at, I'm sorry to go back to War and Peace, but if you look at Napoleon and the Tsar and the Prussian king, when they had like a lovely meeting, they were all friends, they all praised each other, and then they became enemies again. They were at war again. It was all fluid, and it was all about, you know, what that warfare needed at the moment. So those three kings or three emperors meetings, those three emperors were also the quintessential, you know, public figures as frenemies. I mean, even Napoleon in the letter called the Tsar, you know, my brother, my dear friend, you know, is also my enemy, right? In a war declaration.
So maybe there's something there about diplomacy. Like maybe being a frenemy enables you to be the person who does the negotiating. When I went looking for examples in the political world today, I know Hillary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton have launched a podcast. And I'm sorry to say, like a sad rival to ours, of course, but there's then when I was Googling this, I came up with Chelsea Clinton saying that she's no longer friends with Ivanka Trump. And I was like, when were you ever friends? And yeah, and so them sort of talking about, you know, the strange, their roles in history being somewhat similar, and then of course staggeringly different. And then there is like this kind of public obsession with the question of frenemyship. Like there's a movie out, or a movie coming out called Don't Worry, Darling, which is directed by Olivia Wilde. And a lot of entertainment news recently has been dominated by the question of whether the director of this movie is fighting with all of her cast, and whether the cast is all fighting with each other. So, you know, did one cast member spit on another? A real question. in the news that people care about.
Harry
And
Styles, you're talking about.
yes, I'm glad that Whitney also knows this, 'cause I'm taking the class factor of this. You know, we've gone directly from War and Peace to Harry Styles.
I
Take
know.
note.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that like people are wondering about the question of like, are you really fighting or are you not? And I don't know, like then you have all these diplomats who are kind of in the same fulcrum position of maybe pretending to be friends. Like who are the people who are still talking to Putin?
Yeah, I don't know who his frenemies are, but I thought of one. I'll say one from Missouri, local Missouri politics. There was a centrist Republican senator named Jack Danforth, who's now a minister in St. Louis. And he took on Josh Hawley as a protege. And I think Josh Hawley needed his help and like pretended to be his friend and had no interest in being, the kind of centrist, decent person that Jack Danforth for the most part is. And now Jack Danforth has renounced Josh Hawley and like said, I don't know what happened to this kid. Why did he turn out this way? I don't know. But there was a frenemy kind of power relationship there, at least on Josh Hawley's part, I would say, our senator, who turned out to be a very dark figure. But was probably much nicer to Jack Danforth when he needed Jack Danforth's support and endorsement.
Right. Well, now can I ask a question? Can I ask you two a question? Because we've talked about frenemies in literature and in politics. It seems to me frenemies in literature are much more interesting than in real politics. How do you feel about that?
I think that's probably right.
I sure don't want to read any novels about Josh Hawley. I mean, maybe I would actually read a novel by you about Josh Hawley. I just don't want to read anything by Josh Hawley.
I don't want to read a novel about Ivanka Trump and Chelsea Clinton, right?
No, I mean, it just sounds so flat. Yeah, no, I think you make a good point. Maybe then the intersection is right, like novels about politicians, like All the King's Men.
Right.
I think the difference is that Josh Hawley shows no regret for what he did. But in this novel, in your novel, again, we've established they probably aren't frenemies, but their intensity and their caring for each other internally is able to be represented in a way that in the public sphere, when two people are feuding, you can't really get that or feel that. Did Josh Hawley in his real personal self feel a regret when Jack Danforth says, I renounce you? I don't know. I don't care, but I do care about Agnès and Fabienne, and that they are sad to be parted or driven apart by the world, and that's sort of what the novel turns on. So that in that way, that literature allows access to internality that political actions don't.
Right. And in literature, I think also offers a little bit more, backstories. I guess your politicians, we don't know their backstories. They just appear in our view as two public figures.
Well, on that note, Yiyun, we so appreciate your joining us for this conversation and to talk about the Book of Goose. And listeners, don't miss this fabulous novel. It is out September 20th.
Thank you so much, both, for having me.